approximately about a quarter of a mile long. So not a long trail whatsoever. It is just the downhill portion and uphill portion that's a little hard for some people. So if you look right here, you're gonna see some middle steps going down below, quite like these ones that you kind of use to get to this spot right here. Climb down these middle steps. There's gonna be a little narrow passageway right between the sandstone right there, and you're gonna kind of cut in right here, and there'll be some sandstone carved steps too. So some steps actually carved into the sandstone that are different in size and shape too. And I think the furthest one down is about a foot down. And so if you're okay with that, not a huge deal with the downhill portions. If you do have bad knees or anything like that, it can be a little tricky for some folks.
Yeah.
Some people down there, but yeah, you can get a good picture.
Yeah.
Through LA, went to Sacramento, went over to Oregon, onto the coast, and went up the coast to
Yeah, you guys can come right here, over in this
Victoria,
section right there. There's a lot of room for you guys to kind of sit
and
and figure it out.
yeah, we're in Calgary, and then we've been to the Glacier National Park.
I will kind of get to that here shortly, but before talking about Cliff Palace, talk a little bit more about myself, because that's what I do.
Why not?
Yeah, but yeah, I am wearing a volunteer uniform. However, I'm an indigenous intern here in the park, and I actually come from the pueblos of Picaris and Oquewenge in northern New Mexico. So I actually do have ancestral ties to places like Cliff Palace here. So I'm very honored to talk to you folks a little bit about our time here spent in the Four Corners region. And the one thing I do before all of my talks and all my tours is I talk in the language, because I find that's really important to do, just so you folks can kind of hear the language that was spoken, but also in our ways as Pueblo people, it's seen as polite to introduce ourselves before entering these spaces, because, you know, these are communities, these are homes that we're walking amongst here, and so just honoring the fact that people were once here too. There's 21 pueblos today, making up down in south of us in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. And out of those 21 pueblos, there are 6 languages being spoken. That's Tiwa, Tewa, Toa, Hopi, Keres, and Zuni. And I speak 2 of them fluently. I speak Tiwa and I speak Tewa fluently. And so, just starting off with one of them. So, Tukala Chubha, Anant Ioya E, Chubhele Nat Aiha, Ima Tateo, Toya Tataya Tate, Antamene Nat Aihan, Fulpaine, Hankano Nat Aihan, Kuachan, Antapi Omehe Chate, Pohanta Namiamepo, Akiri Simichita Achanaho. So, thank you folks for letting me do that real quickly for you guys. Pretty much what I did was I just introduced myself, but I also told you guys, hopefully you learned something here and you take it back with you wherever you guys come from too. So with that being said, let's get started talking about Cliff Palace here. And so, Cliff Palace, it's huge. It's seen to a lot of archaeologists and a lot of us Pueblo people too as a central spot in this whole region here. There's a lot of different epicenters that are happening in the Pueblo world at that time period. So huge capital cities, if you will, of the Pueblo world in this Four Corners region. A lot of them will be like Chaco Canyon, Aztec, and Cliff Palace here. This, as you can kind of tell, would have been a huge area where people were gathering. Not only people amongst this landscape, but in far different areas that people were trading with. A lot of this is kind of seen as a central area for all of that here. But there's a lot of stuff that happens before Cliff Palace and before that people come into these cliffside dwellings. So about 550 AD is when we see evidence of permanent structures being established here at Mesa Verde in the form of pit house structures, and then later on in Pueblo Top or Mesa Top Pueblos, all that kind of occurs first. And about 1190, in the late portions of the 1100s, do people come into these cliffside dwellings. And so they're going to occupy these structures until about 1280, until about 1300. So pretty much for about a century do people live in these sites. So that's pretty much 2-3 generations actually kind of live here, and that's about it. at that 1300 mark is when people are going to migrate down south of us and make up the modern pueblos in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas today. So I just summarized 700 years within right now in that little short section right here. But a lot's occurring at this time period in the 1100s, the late 1100s here. So people are coming to these areas. So for you folks here, kind of thinking for yourselves, why would you want to come to these sites? Why would you want to come and make your homes in the cliff sites? Safe, yeah. And that could come in different forms, yeah. So safety for one reason. Anybody else?
Cool.
Cool, yeah, yeah, figuratively and literally too. Yeah. Anybody else? Special and close to your water source. So those are all really, really good ones.
And security,
and
because
security.
you can see.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So safety and all that, it comes in different forms. So you are safe, you're out of your elements really well. And that's why these sites preserve for so well too, is because you're out of your elements, specifically rain and snow. So if you look at the very top there, you're gonna see all that black. That's not caused from soot. That's actually what we call desert varnish, and that indicates where moisture is kind of heading towards during times of monsoon rains or when snow melts. So you can tell it doesn't actually hit these structures, and so that's why they're so well preserved over time. But safety too, a lot of different people, when they come to these areas, they think a lot of this is for defensive features, and some of these definitely are. So if you go to like Balcony House, for example, that original tunnel that they have there, that's a defensive feature. If you go to Square Tower House, and you look at that crow's nest, that lookout point, that's definitely defensive. But here, not a lot of defensive features, if you will. All these towers, like that one over there, and this complex over here, those would have been residential areas and different areas for storage. Those weren't necessarily lookout points. And it kind of makes sense too, because in a cliff site, you would have a more of an advantage looking at the very tops, even just in that structure, than in these towers right here. So not necessarily for defensive features. And I think that kind of comes back to this idea of calling it Cliff Palace itself. You know, a palace is a fort and you're trying to protect it. This is not a fort, this is not a palace, this is a village. This is a community right here that we're looking at. But I heard it earlier, and I think you said it, and my favorite reasons to be next to the water source here. When you look at a canyon like this one here, you're expecting there to be some sort of creek down below. There's not a creek now, and there was never a creek when ancestral Pueblo people lived here as well. And so what they relied on were natural seep springs that occurred in these alcove sites. So there's hundreds of them throughout these canyons here. But these natural seep springs are what actually carve out these natural alcoves too. So if they're active for a long enough period of time, because sandstone's very brittle, natural erosion's actually gonna like do its thing. And so, you know, there was a seep spring back here at one point in time, and it would carve out this huge natural alcove. And so I just like that idea that because water is so essential to this area in this arid climate that we're at here, that people are actually incorporating it into their communities too. And it's kind of seen as a central point in all of it. So that's my favorite reason why. But, you know, what allows for these structures to actually be established too is agriculture. What allows for these people to settle down in this one area for 700 years, not only within cliff dwelling sites, but in total on this mesa top, what allows for people to live here that long is agriculture. So they're growing beans, corn, and squash, but primarily corn. Corn is an essential one here in this whole entire idea. And that's the one crop that allows for people to like settle in this one spot. And even today in the modern pueblos, corn is held at such a high spot in our societies. It's seen as a living being. In a lot of these structures too, they put corn cobs in their mortar even as well because of its essential point in this whole story too. And so they're all farming at the tops of these mesas here. And so if you go in different areas, you're going to see check dams where they're kind of diverting water. But what they're doing here is they're practicing dry farming techniques. So dry farming techniques means they're relying solely on monsoon rains. They're not relying on any type of irrigation of any sort of that, just monsoon rains. And so that's really impressive to do, especially in a climate like this, you know? If you go down south of us in Arizona, for example, the Hopi tribes, all Pueblos still practice dry farming techniques. But I always say that Hopi in northeastern Arizona, they perfect dry farming techniques there. That's where they're actually burying their corn about a foot deep down there to get moisture that's needed for these crops. And they've been without water for a really long time. If you ever go look at Hopi and on their separate mesas, not a lot of water is present there either. And you get to see how they make the... get a good sense of the grandness of it all from the overviews and from the alcove. You see it for what it is, but from here you can actually see how big the site is actually. And like a lot's happening, and like I said, with those turkey feathers and black and white style pottery, those are exports leaving these areas. And Cliff Palace right here is kind of seen as a central spot for a really vast network of trading that's occurring amongst this landscape here. So you see a lot of goods coming to this area, as far south even as into parts of like southern Mexico, into parts of Central America too. You see goods like parrot feathers, cocoa beans, all that coming from those directions to the south. As far west as the Pacific Ocean, you see seashells incorporated into jewelry here too. So people are traveling vast distances too, and this is kind of seen as a focal point and all that. So out of those 25 homes that I said earlier are seen as residential, the other 125 rooms, a lot of them are going to be storage facilities. A lot of them will be seasonally lived in for occasions, and a lot of them can be seen also, some archaeologists like to say, like administrative offices that kind of help, with that whole trade network system that's occurring here at that time period. The tree rings and count them and get an accurate date of when these trees were harvested. And so that's how we can kind of indicate late 1100s till about 1280 was when construction happened. But majority of the construction, the main construction phase, happened between about 1260 until about 1280. So majority of what we're looking at here took about 20 years to create. It's not that long of a time.
Not bad.
That's one generation creating most of what we're looking at here. That's the main one.
Draft.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, so that's the main one. When you look at this mortar here too, you're gonna see all this original mortar. The mortar is pretty much made up of 3 ingredients, and that's gonna be clay, ash, and sand. And like I was talking about earlier, water is not a huge resource here. You're definitely working with certain limitations, and within those natural seep springs that occur here in the park and in these canyons, they're no bigger than a puddle. So not a lot of water to work with. And those seep springs, their only sole purpose is to help give drinking water to these people here, not for making the mortar. So you could tell that they would have probably more than likely waited for like that shift in seasons between winter till spring to actually utilize snow melt to make the mortar here too.
Ferocious innocent.
Oh, is that? I just thought about that.
Well, I can understand it.
Yeah, like a bluebird, but yeah, we're all gonna try to squeeze within this long with us today.
Thank you.
Was this undiscovered for a while?
Yeah, so Pueblo people were gonna keep coming back decades and decades for a long, long time. Navajo, Apache presence knew about these areas too, but never came here. First Anglos to actually see this for the first time was in 1881. Yeah. Awesome, great. So let's get going. I know this group is waiting for us right down there. But if you guys want to, I'll make a deal with you guys. If you guys promise me you won't touch the walls, I'll move the do not enter sign for you folks to get to look in the interior too. So we'll move in this direction here, and then once you
From north, so we haven't seen a lot yet,
yeah.
but we will.
Yeah, you will see a lot. Yeah, like my area, like the Rio Grande area.
Silverton.